Good morning. It's Thursday, the 30th of November here in London. This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Europe podcast. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Coming up today, a last-minute extension in the temporary truce between Israel and Hamas for one more day.
Henry Kissinger dies. The former US Secretary of State who defined American foreign policy passes away aged 100.
Plus, Musk slings expletives. The owner of X has some choice words for advertisers boycotting the platform.
Let's start with a roundup of our top stories.
Israel and Hamas have agreed to extend their truce for at least another day. Israel's military and Hamas confirmed separately that the ceasefire would continue beyond this morning. Qatar, the main mediator in the talks, says its efforts to broker a permanent end to hostilities are continuing. Ahead of the announcement, the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken explained what he hopes to achieve during his visit to the region.
We'll discuss with Israel how it can achieve its objective of ensuring that the terrorist attacks of October 7th never happen again, while sustaining and increasing humanitarian assistance and minimizing further suffering and casualties among Palestinian civilians.
US Secretary of State Antony Blinken is currently in Tel Aviv for his third visit since the October 7th attack. He'll also visit the West Bank as part of the trip. The visit comes as more captives were exchanged yesterday, with 10 hostages being released by Hamas in exchange for 30 Palestinians held by Israel.
Now, Henry Kissinger has died at the age of 100, a child refugee who fled Nazi persecution in his native Germany. He rose to become US Secretary of State and defined American foreign policy during the Cold War. Bloomberg's Ian Marlowe explains how his views helped to shape US positions.
Around the world, in Asia, in the Middle East, could be a polarizing figure, but I think that was in part because he embodied that sort of American power. He was one of the people at the center of American power, and over a long period of time when the U.S. role in the world was also changing. And it is, to some extent, an end of an era, and I think very few people, get close to 100 and are still sort of active in civil society.
Ian Marlowe reflecting there on the way that Henry Kissinger defined US overseas policy during the 1970s with his strategies to end the Vietnam War and contain communist countries.
The Fed's latest beige book showed economic activity slowed in recent weeks as consumers pulled back on discretionary spending. Today's US data may add to the soft landing narrative, with core PCE inflation expected to have slowed in October to 3.5%. And Atlanta Fed President Raphael Bostic says he's growing increasingly confident that inflation is firmly on a downward path. On the other hand, Richmond Fed President Thomas Barkin told CNBC he isn't yet convinced.
I think you want to have the option of doing more on rates. And I guess the bigger point is there's no precision that anyone can point to at exactly what is the level of rates that exactly handles inflation in exactly the way you want to handle it. And so you're constantly trying to adjust on the fly as you learn more about the economy, as you learn more about the impact of demand on inflation. And that's what we're learning as we go.
That's Thomas Barkin on CNBC. Traders are already pricing in policy easing for 2024, with the first cut now expected to come in May.
Now to more economic data. China's manufacturing and services sectors slipped in November, adding pressure for more government stimulus. Bloomberg's Brian Curtis has more now from Hong Kong.
The official manufacturing PMI fell to 49.4, the second consecutive month of contraction. It was weaker than the estimate of 49.8. Non-manufacturing activity unexpectedly eased to 50.2, barely into expansion. China's economy is still on track to grow around 5% for 2023. The questions remain about momentum for next year. Manufacturing, services, and the property sector all seem troubled. Falling home sales have curbed demand for just about everything. In Hong Kong, Brian Curtis, Bloomberg Radio.
Turning now to news from one of China's largest investment banks that's warned its analysts to avoid criticising the economy and showing off their lavish lifestyles. According to an internal memo seen by Bloomberg, analysts at China International Capital Corp can no longer share negative macro or market commentary in public or private. The note also advises employees not to avoid wearing luxury brands or revealing their salaries. The guidance highlights growing self-scrutiny at Chinese financial institutions after authorities called out bankers' quote, hedonistic lifestyles earlier this year. China is trying to restore market confidence following weak economic performance, but investors remain concerned about restricted access to transparent data.
JP Morgan says that artificial intelligence tools are starting to generate revenue for the bank, with future advances likely to produce even more results. That story now from Bloomberg's Charlie Pellet.
The bank's chief data and analytics officer, Teresa Heitzenrether, said in addition to efficiency and potential cost avoidance, the bank is seeing revenue-generating activity, and that's really encouraging. Her remarks came at the Evident AI Symposium. JP Morgan set a target last year of $1 billion in so-called business value generated by AI in 2023, and the firm increased that goal to $1.5 billion at its Investor Day in May. In New York, Charlie Pellet, Bloomberg Radio.
Elon Musk says an advertising boycott against his social media platform X may kill the company. Speaking at the New York Times Dealbook Conference on Wednesday, the billionaire said that if advertisers leave the company, the failure of the business would be their fault, and he swore at them. Musk's outburst comes after he endorsed an antisemitic post, something he called the, quote, worst and dumbest thing I've ever done. Bloomberg's Annabelle Drewler said Musk's actions are bolstering support for X's competitors.
Since he took over the platform about a year ago, we've actually seen about 60% of advertisers leaving, but it really has intensified, and it is in the wake of him endorsing that anti-Semitic conspiracy theory just about 2 weeks ago. So in the fallout from that, for instance, we saw IBM suspending their ads, Apple, Disney, Lionsgate, the European Commission, all of these soon followed. You saw that pick up in Threads, which is Meta Platform's version of X, and of course as a competitor, President Biden posted on that for the first time.
That's our reporter Annabelle Drewlers. Elon Musk also addressed his market power during the address, saying that his influence is not due to anti-competitive actions, but because his companies have, quote, executed well.
In a moment, we are going to be hearing from the Binance CEO who's been speaking to Bloomberg's Francine Lacroix about plans to overhaul the business, the crypto space and so much more. But firstly, we must say a word about the death of Henry Kissinger, of course. This diplomat who spanned so many decades and whose advice was still sought out, who gave an interview at the age of 99 to Bloomberg, indeed, has passed away in Connecticut, Harvard professor It fled effectively the Nazis, then spent decades under Republican presidents Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford, carving out America's role in geopolitics around the world. His influence is so enormous. He opened up diplomatic relations to China. He was criticised for supporting or being silent on some of the biggest disasters in geopolitics, and yet a force of nature, and perhaps, one of the people, along with US presidents, who's had the most influence on the trajectory of the United States. And
a name who still had weight right up until his death as well. I mean, this idea, his doctrine of balancing diplomacy and force to achieve, I suppose, influence around the world, a fresh approach to foreign policy at the time, and also putting him at odds with those who were advocating for perhaps more idealistic approaches to how America should influence its place in the world as well. Not without criticism, as you said, certainly backing the regime of Augusto Pinochet in Chile being one of the things that he was criticised for, supporting bombing campaigns in Vietnam and Cambodia, but nonetheless a very influential figure on foreign relations, but American foreign policy in particular.
Yeah, absolutely. And from that, we'll have much more on the life of Henry Kissinger throughout the programme. But let's go to the immediate story in geopolitics this morning. So the truce between Israel and Hamas, in place since Friday, has been extended for at least another day. Overnight, 10 more hostages were released by Hamas, and Israel released 30 Palestinians. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken is in Israel today, whilst also overnight the announcement of the death of Henry Kissinger, as we've mentioned. Joining us now to discuss this, Bloomberg's head of Middle East and North Africa coverage, Stuart Livingston-Wallace. Stuart, very good to have you with us. The extension of this truce, it is perhaps another day then. How many more hostages, though, are there that Hamas has?
Yeah, good morning, Caroline. It's actually very hard to say. So we know 240 were taken initially, but as you said, some released overnight. There've been batches before then. So we think we're probably up to around the sort of 70-odd mark, but there have been side deals as well. So, for instance, overnight you saw some joint Thai nationals released. Amongst others, we know Russians have been released outside of this main process. So we're not entirely sure what the number is. We think it's probably in excess of 150 still left, but even within that number, it's very hard to get a breakdown of how many of those are civilians and how many of those are soldiers that were taken on October the 7th.
Antony Blinken in Israel. What happens next in the diplomatic efforts around this, Stuart? Qatar says that its efforts to try and extend the truce further are continuing.
Yeah, and I think there's been sort of two series of talks this week. So earlier in the week, you had the head of the CIA and the head of Mossad in Qatar to talk to the Qatari Prime Minister, who's been one of these pivotal figures in all the negotiations, sort of acting as the honest broker. And that was very much focused on the truce, that was focused on hostages and sort of the immediate, as it were. Blinken is there really to do two things or focus on two things. Number one is what is the longer term solution to this problem, or what are the potential solutions that might be on the table and that all sides can agree on. And number two, the issue of humanitarian aid. So we have seen a large increase in the amount of aid coming into Gaza, but obviously it remains far below what was going in before this all started, but also just, purely on a numerical basis, you've got more than 2 million people there. A few aid trucks every day is not really going to solve the problem.
And there's another story, though, that has influence in the region. Saudi Arabia has offered investment in exchange for Iran reining in its proxies and its support for proxies. What do we know about what has been discussed?
That's right. I mean, it is really one more example of the shift that we've seen in Saudi foreign policy over the last year or two. And that is one in which effectively they have come to the conclusion that in order to achieve their economic goals and their social development goals, that is the so-called Vision 2030, they need regional peace. And they've again come to the conclusion that if you have regional stability, you have economic growth for everyone, and everyone benefits from that. Having a series of wars or proxy wars going on in the region just destabilizes everything. Now, in some instances, somewhat cynically, that may mean a higher oil price, but in the long run, that doesn't really help anyone. So what this appears to be is a series of suggestions to Iran, which again, remember, there's been a lot of enmity between these two countries for a very, very long time, going back really to 1979 with the Iranian Revolution. And the idea is build economic ties. By doing so, you restrain Iran's proxies dotted right across the region, and in turn, economic growth, prosperity, and ultimately that is what Saudi Arabia wants, is a stronger economy, not just its own, but the region as a whole.
Stuart, another story that we're following today is the death of Henry Kissinger, former US Secretary of State. How pivotal was he in formulating America's current stance towards the Middle East and the State of Israel?
I mean, you can certainly draw a line between them. I mean, they have taken on a somewhat different nature. But if you think back to sort of post-Yom Kippur War, where he sort of engineered this peace between Israel and Egypt that ultimately, several years later, admittedly, led to Egypt recognizing Israel. And that peace has held. It's been pretty much half a century since then, and it is still going on. Now, you can draw a line between that and what the structure that you see today, which is sort of based around the so-called Abraham Accords that you've had various countries sign up to, including the Emirates and Bahrain and Morocco and so on. And more importantly, it looked like Saudi Arabia was moving towards that sort of deal as well. So there are echoes there. I mean, I would say that the situation has changed and the sort of the art of diplomacy has changed, but the basic idea that you sort of have recognition, again, in return for a degree of prosperity and peace, that is absolutely still sort of the central features of the current policy. Very interesting. Stuart, thank you so much for being with us this morning. Bloomberg's head of Middle East and North Africa coverage, so Stuart Livingston Wallace, joining us live this morning.
To some other news now, and the new CEO of crypto exchange Binance says he's in no rush to reshape the company's top leadership team after a $4.3 billion settlement with the US Department of Justice that forced Binance's co-founder CZ to step down. Richard Teng has been speaking to Bloomberg's Francine Lacqua about his plans to overhaul the business. She asked him if he has a mandate to change the company, given CZ is still a major shareholder.
Without CZ's trust and the other leadership's trust, and indeed trust of the thousands of employees that we have, which I hold very dearly, I would not have taken up this role. And this role, given the changing industry, a maturing industry with a direction of travel that's much more regulated, requires us to continue to work with all the important stakeholders that I mentioned, to continue to push ahead and foster, enhance the growth of the industry. So I'm very confident that we'll continue to grow from a position of strength on that front, which is why I take up this role. I use all my experience, my endeavor to make sure that we succeed for the future.
Will He maintain her current executive role at the firm?
Well, our core team remains intact, and it's very important, right? So we have a strong expertise of core team. But at the same time, we continue to make investments into intellectual human talent, which is very important for our industry because the industry evolves so quickly, right? Things are evolving, new developments come up by the day. But we continue to enhance our bench strength, continue to invest in our talent pool, continue to invest heavily into our compliance program. And I'm very confident that we'll continue to grow from strength to strength.
On your market share that has fallen because of the latest events, how will you stop that market share from being eroded? How do you grow from here?
Well, I think two responses to that. Firstly, as I mentioned, we are focused on building the ecosystem. Today is at a very early stage of development, only 5% crypto adoption. If we can double, triple, quadruple that, right? Even if our market share falls, everyone in the industry, including ourselves, will be much stronger, right, on that front. In terms of, I think related to that, you're probably going to ask, market share is falling, user trust may be eroded. That's not the case. Yeah. The user numbers continue to grow. And today, we have 166 million. Last week, I reported a slightly lower figure. But the users trust us because of our consistency of action. We take our custodial responsibility very seriously. In the last 6 years, going into the future, user assets are back 1-to-1. It's very important to remember, as part of the settlement, the US regulators have scrutinized our operations in quite great detail. And they do not allege there's misappropriation of user funds, which is extremely important, right? So our commitment to users is you can withdraw the assets any point in time, 100%, and that the user safety, user protection, user security, very dear and very important to us.
When do you think, Richard, Binance can be a fully compliant crypto exchange with the working licenses, complete transparency? Will it take years? And if so, is it 2 years? Is it 4 years? Is it 5 years? Again, give us a sense of what kind of time frame you're looking at.
I think it really depends on regulators as well, right? We are already regulated in 18 different jurisdictions. As I mentioned, 2/3 of global regulators have not started to regulate this space. And we are working with many of them that have approached us, by virtue of us being the largest crypto player globally. And we are responsible players, right? We want to be regulated, we want to work very closely with them to, on the one hand, support innovation and investments into this space, which makes the country much better in terms of foreign direct investments. And on the other hand, control the risk, right, element. So we are responsible players. We look to work with all regulators that wish to introduce safety, soundness, regulation into this space. And we'll continue to do so.
Would you ever actually consider an IPO to be fully transparent?
Well, the company is in strong financial shape. Those elements, I think, at this point in time, are not my priority. My priority is to make sure that we continue to press ahead with the commitments to our stakeholders, which include our users, stakeholders like regulators to comply with global standards, and working with partners to bring about greater crypto adoption, right? So that the whole industry, the ecosystem, continue to develop in the right way. We continue to develop and grow this very exciting industry together for everyone. Bring in new talent pool, bring in new investments. Those are my key priority. Future needs really depends. I think it's too early to speculate.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.